There is a ledger, brittle with age, hidden in the archives of a small Virginia library. It records births and deaths, unions and bloodlines, stretching back almost 2 centuries. Among its pages is the account of a child who should never have existed, born into a family that had been carefully, obsessively closing itself off for generations. The family called him a prodigy. Doctors called him something else entirely. What they found within his body would haunt the lineage forever, forcing a confrontation with a truth they had long avoided. What becomes of a bloodline when devotion to its purity eclipses reason? Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The Harrington family arrived in colonial Virginia in 1651. English gentry, minor nobility, their name carried weight in London, but the New World gave them something else entirely, complete dominion over their lineage. They did not yet call it obsession, they called it duty. By 1705, they had established what family correspondence referred to as the Compact. It was simple, cruel in its clarity: marry within the family, protect the estate, guard the blood, preserve the name. At first, this was conventional. Cousin marriages were accepted among the elite. But while other families gradually welcomed outsiders, the Harringtons doubled down. They built Rosewood Manor, 30 miles from the nearest town. Their children were educated at home, their chapel was private, and by the turn of the 19th century, they had become a closed circle. Meticulous records tracked every birth, every marriage, every union. Lather, bound tomes detailed a chronology of inheritance and lineage. They were not preserving history, they were engineering it. First cousins married first cousins, then second cousins married each other, and so the cycle repeated. Names recycled endlessly: Jonathan, Abigail, Samuel, Margaret. Portraits in oil and daguerreotype reflected the same faces over decades, echoing with unsettling familiarity. By 1890, the Harringtons were more than isolated. They were biologically unique, a population unto themselves. They were proud. They believed they had achieved something exceptional, a bloodline untouched by outside influence. They imagined themselves guardians of purity, blind to the consequences of repetition. The first signs emerged in the 1870s, a daughter born with an extra toe, a boy whose legs bowed painfully, stillbirths that followed one another in grim succession. The family considered these occurrences God's will, interred the children quietly in the family cemetery behind Rosewood Manor, and made no mention of them in letters or diaries. The Compact demanded continuity, and continuity demanded disregard for suffering. By 1900, the Harrington family tree had ceased to resemble a tree. It had become a knot. Lines twisted back on themselves, repeating names, duplicating relations. A man might be an uncle, a cousin, and a grandfather all at once. A woman could be both aunt and sister-in-law to the same child. Kinship had broken down mathematically, biology strained under the weight of deliberate repetition. The outside world noticed little. Wealth and isolation cloaked eccentricity as tradition. Visitors remarked that the family all looked alike. Sharp noses, deep-set eyes, heads tilted just so, as if perpetually surveying something beneath them. They said aristocratic, they said pure. No one spoke the truth. In 1921, a young Harrington named Eleanor tried to defy the Compact. She was 17 and had glimpsed the world beyond Rosewood's gates through books smuggled by a sympathetic tutor. She asked to marry a man outside the family, a merchant from Richmond. Her father, Jonathan Harrington VI, replied with 4 minutes of icy clarity: leave, and she would be erased. Her name struck from the family Bible, her portrait removed from the walls, her existence reduced to a ghost. Eleanor stayed. 6 months later, she married her first cousin, William. The first child was born in 1923, a daughter who survived only 3 days. The second, a boy in 1925, survived but never spoke. He sat quietly rocking back and forth, eyes fixed on nothing, as if he were already inhabiting a place beyond the comprehension of his family or their physician, Dr. Leonard Graves, who had served the Harringtons for decades. The third child, a daughter born in 1927, appeared healthy at first, but by age 4, seizures began. She died before 8. By 1934, Eleanor had been pregnant 7 times. Only 3 children survived infancy, and none of them were typical. Visitors ceased to come. The estate's shutters remained closed. The gates were bolted. Within those walls, something was unraveling. Then, in January 1937, Eleanor became pregnant again. At 32, exhausted from repeated pregnancies, she expected complications. But this child was different. She carried him without incident. Hope whispered that perhaps this one would be the culmination of centuries of careful breeding. Perfect, unharmed, a vindication of the compact. He was born on September 2, 1937. They named him Isaac, after his great-great-grandfather. Dr. Graves, examining him, was silent for a full minute. The nurses, sworn to secrecy, exchanged uneasy glances. Eleanor wept, not with joy, but with a nameless apprehension. Isaac Harrington was beautiful, unnaturally so. Symmetry defined him, his eyes were bright and clear. But Dr. Graves found anomalies. His heart was on the right side, organs mirrored, bones extra where they should not exist, and blood cells deformed in ways that should have been impossible. Isaac's body had been recopied, and corrupted over 16 generations, each blueprint introducing errors too subtle to notice at birth, but evident under scrutiny. Yet he lived. He cried, he fed, he breathed. The family whispered behind closed doors. Dr. Graves wrote in his journal, "I have delivered a child who should not exist. Whether he is a miracle or a warning, I cannot say." By the winter of 1938, Isaac Harrington was 6 months old. He thrived physically in ways that should have reassured his mother. Eleanor, yet unease, clung to him like a shadow. He did not cry at discomfort, did not startle at sudden noises, did not seek warmth or comfort. Nurses, once instructed to observe his every twitch, grew uneasy. Even Dr. Leonard Graves, whose career had encompassed decades of unusual cases, admitted privately that he had never seen anything like this child. Isaac's eyes were perhaps the most disturbing. They followed movement, but not with curiosity. There was awareness without engagement, a perception that seemed detached, almost alien. When Eleanor held him, his limbs remained stiff. He did not curl into her embrace. He did not react to her heartbeat or her whispered reassurances. Observing him was like watching a clockwork doll, perfectly formed, yet animated by something outside of human understanding. By his first birthday in 1938, whispers began among the Harrington household. The servants, though loyal, would speak in hushed tones behind closed doors. "He's not like us," they murmured. Not really. Eleanor, despite her maternal instincts, felt a shiver of fear whenever she looked into his clear, unnervingly calm eyes. Jonathan Harrington VI, ever the strict guardian of the compact, dismissed her concerns. "He is our blood," he said. "That is enough." Yet even he could not completely mask a twitch of apprehension in the solitude of his study. Isaac's growth continued to confound. His body developed at an accelerated, almost erratic pace. Limbs elongated unevenly, joints bent at peculiar angles. His head, though symmetric, had ridges and contours unseen in normal anatomy. Dr. Graves, consulting medical texts and journals, noted that Isaac's body exhibited a convergence of rare congenital anomalies. The combination should have been fatal. Yet the boy thrived. At 18 months, the Harringtons noticed something far stranger than physical abnormality. Isaac began staring at mirrors, not as a child might play, not to mimic or explore his reflection, but with prolonged, unblinking focus, as if the surface of glass were a window into another realm. Eleanor tried speaking to him during these episodes. He did not turn his head, he did not respond. Occasionally, he would make small, rhythmic sounds, tones that seemed deliberate, almost language-like, though they had no recognizable structure. By 1939, the isolation of Rosewood Manor became more pronounced. Guests, already rare, ceased altogether. The family's gatherings dwindled. Windows remained shuttered against the winter light. The estate felt as though it had retreated into itself, collapsing inward around the boy, whose very existence defied explanation. Dr. Graves' visits became infrequent, not out of negligence, but from mounting dread. At 73, his hands shook when holding stethoscopes, instruments that no longer felt adequate against the mystery before him. Then came the spring of 1940, when Eleanor insisted he be examined once more. Isaac, now nearly 3, exhibited a behavior that chilled her to the core. He would wander into the library alone, sit in a chair too large for his frame, and gaze at books he could not yet read, or perhaps already did. Sometimes he would turn to a blank wall and trace shapes in the air with his fingers, repeating patterns with a precision that made Eleanor step back. She had begun to wonder if the boy's mind was working on a level no human could comprehend. Dr. Graves arrived on a cold afternoon in April. Isaac sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on the cracked leather bindings of the library shelves. Graves spoke to him, clapped his hands, gently touched his shoulder. The boy's head turned mechanically, eyes meeting the doctor's in a way that suggested not recognition, but calculation. In his journal, Graves would later write, "I looked into Isaac's eyes and saw not a child, but something beyond the child, a presence contained, yet vast, an intelligence that is both alien and human." Alone in the library, Dr. Graves did what he had never done before. He addressed Isaac as though he were an adult, speaking in tones meant to coax understanding rather than elicit simple reaction. "I do not know what you are," he said, "but I know you are not what they believe you to be." For the first time, Isaac made coherent sounds that resembled deliberate speech. It was not a word the doctor recognized, but it carried intent, a consciousness behind the syllables. Graves, pen poised, felt a terror he could not rationalize. He closed his journal after that session, fearful that even the written word might fail to convey what he had witnessed. The family, for their part, continued the charade of normalcy. Eleanor whispered reassurances to herself. Jonathan Harrington VI maintained his rigid enforcement of the compact, and servants silently observed a child who seemed to exist both within and outside their reality. The boy's anomalies, physical, neurological, and behavioral, were catalogued, studied, and hidden from the world. And still, Isaac thrived. By the time he turned 3, it was clear that isolation was no longer sufficient. The boy's presence alone seemed to warp the household, bending it towards secrecy and tension. It was in these months that Eleanor, in the quiet of her room, asked herself the question that would haunt the family for generations. Had they created something to perfect the compact, or had they created something they could never hope to contain? By late 1940, the peculiarities of Isaac Harrington had begun to draw more attention within the family itself. The older children, who had been taught obedience from birth, began speaking in whispers about their youngest brother. "He watches us," one would say. "Not like a child, like a shadow." Eleanor, exhausted and fearful, recorded her own observations in a private ledger, notes never meant for anyone else's eyes. Isaac had developed an uncanny precision in small movements. When handed blocks or toys, he arranged them with geometric exactness, building structures that were not whimsical, but mathematical. Dr. Graves, observing quietly during a brief visit, noted that Isaac's hands moved as though guided by a mind capable of calculation far beyond his years. Yet the boy never smiled, never spoke in the conventional sense, and never sought comfort. Eleanor could feel her own heart tighten each time she tried to embrace him, only to be met with cold rigidity. The Harringtons, ever devoted to their family compact, began to grow wary. Jonathan Harrington VI instructed the household staff to observe Isaac closely, documenting any anomalies. Even the servants, sworn to silence, found themselves unnerved. He did not cry in hunger. He did not react to heat or cold. Once, a candle fell near him, and he simply watched the flame dance across the rug, eyes unblinking, before turning to examine the pattern it left on the floor. Eleanor had never felt such fear, and yet she could not bring herself to condemn her own child. It was in the summer of 1941 that the first irreversible signs became apparent. Isaac's body was subtly, but unmistakably different from other children his age. His spine twisted slightly, almost as though following a design unknown to human anatomy. His joints bent at angles that made the staff avert their eyes. Even the way he walked, stiff, calculated shuffle, seemed preternatural, as though his body obeyed commands from an intelligence separate from Eleanor or Jonathan. The family doctor, Dr. Graves, returned after a particularly disturbing incident. Isaac had been found in the main hall at dawn, tracing the molding on the ceiling in a pattern too intricate for a child. Graves examined him extensively, measuring, prodding, and recording notes. He observed that Isaac's internal organs exhibited subtle misalignments, minor inversions of the normal arrangement that alone would not be life-threatening, but the combination of anomalies, the skeletal irregularities, the internal deviations, the neurological peculiarities, presented a case he could not reconcile with ordinary medicine. Eleanor's fears grew. She began to notice that Isaac seemed to perceive the household in ways no human could. He could predict the arrival of staff, anticipate footsteps, and often appear in a room before anyone else. At meals, he would sit perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, as if counting invisible points of light, while the rest of the family ate in uneasy silence. Jonathan Harrington V., observing his son, became both fascinated and unsettled. The compact had always sought to preserve purity, but it was clear that Isaac's existence surpassed anything the family had ever intended. By autumn, Isaac's behavior had escalated further. He began producing sounds, soft, melodic, repetitive, that resembled speech but were entirely unrecognizable. Dr. Graves, in private, suggested that Eleanor consider whether the boy was communicating in a form beyond human comprehension. Eleanor refused to entertain the thought, instead convincing herself it was an elaborate quirk, a strange but harmless symptom of isolation and heredity. Yet the ledger she kept told another story. Page after page, she recorded patterns, repetitions, and behaviors that seemed deliberate, intelligent, almost ritualistic. The family's isolation deepened. Friends were no longer invited, and any remaining connections to the outside world were severed. Even neighbors, curious about the Harrington estate and its long-standing reputation for eccentricity, found themselves rebuffed. The household had become a fortress not merely of brick and iron, but of secrecy and dread. Every room, every corridor, seemed to echo with the silent presence of a child who did not entirely belong to the human realm. Dr. Graves' journal from this period reflects a mixture of awe and terror. He wrote, "This child is neither sick nor normal. He is something beyond our definitions. I have observed the greatest extremes of congenital anomaly, yet Isaac exceeds them all. I fear what the family will do if they come to understand the full measure of what they have created. Already, they treat him with reverence and fear, as though he were both heir and curse. The compact has succeeded beyond their imagination, but at what cost?" Winter of 1941 brought another development. Isaac began to show an affinity for written symbols. He would pick up pencils and, without instruction, reproduce patterns resembling numbers, letters, and occasionally abstract diagrams that no one could decipher. The family, already terrified by his intelligence, struggled to interpret his purpose. Eleanor suspected the boy was attempting communication. Jonathan Harrington VA, proud yet cautious, forbade interference, insisting the compact's secrecy be maintained above all else. And so, the cycle continued. Isaac's body, mind, and behaviors became more extraordinary, more isolating, and more impossible to reconcile with ordinary human experience. Eleanor began to whisper prayers at night, not for his health, but for guidance, for protection from the knowledge of what he truly was. The Harringtons had created a legacy of purity and secrecy spanning 16 generations. And now, in Isaac, that legacy had taken on a form none could have predicted. A child whose very existence challenged the family's understanding of blood, inheritance, and humanity itself. By early 1942, Isaac Harrington had begun to occupy every thought of his mother, Eleanor, and his father, Jonathan V.I. What had once been quiet unease now rippled through the household like a persistent shadow. Isaac no longer merely observed the world. He seemed to understand it in ways that were impossible. He would sit for hours in the main hall, tracing the carved patterns on the floorboards with a single finger, pausing occasionally to tilt his head, as if listening to some inaudible rhythm. Eleanor feared to speak in his presence, afraid that sound itself might provoke a response she could not comprehend. The family doctor, Dr. Graves, had begun visiting less frequently. The boy's development defied medical texts, and each examination left the old physician shaken. On one such visit in March, Graves wrote in his private journal, "I have studied human anomaly for 40 years, yet this child surpasses all precedent. He is not merely malformed, he is deliberate, precise, and, dare I say it, purposeful." The Harringtons have preserved their compact with rigor, and now the compact has returned to them in a form I cannot name without fear. Isaac's physical peculiarities had progressed. His spine developed a subtle, unnatural curvature, more pronounced than the typical scoliosis he had exhibited months before. His hands, long and slender, bore small extra phalanges that seemed perfectly functional. His skull had begun to develop ridges and depressions that suggested intelligence manifesting in the very bone. Eleanor could feel the tension in the house, an almost palpable dread that pulsed with every tick of the grandfather clock. Even Jonathan V.A., normally stoic and proud, seemed smaller in Isaac's presence, as though the boy's gaze, fixed and unblinking, could weigh upon him like gravity. Isaac's communication evolved in ways that unnerved Eleanor the most. The melodic sounds he had produced months earlier had grown into structured sequences, patterns that repeated and shifted in complexity. Eleanor attempted to interpret them, thinking perhaps he was mimicking language, but she could not discern a single recognizable word. The sequences were not music, nor speech, but something in between, an abstract cipher of sound. Late one evening, Eleanor approached Isaac in the nursery. She whispered his name, softly, afraid to startle him. The boy did not flinch. He slowly raised his hand and pointed toward the window, where moonlight cast a long, trembling shadow across the floor. Then he began producing the rhythmic sounds, rising and falling in a cadence that seemed to align with the shifting shadows themselves. Eleanor froze. It was as though he was not speaking to her, but to the room, to the very architecture of Ashcroft Hall, calling forth a pattern no human was meant to notice. Jonathan V.I., when informed, was fascinated but terrified. The family's compact had always been about control, about predictability and preservation. But Isaac was neither controllable nor predictable. He was an anomaly cultivated across 16 generations, now fully realized in a living, breathing child. Jonathan's pride wrestled with his fear. To speak against Isaac was to acknowledge the fragile empire they had built, a lineage so tightly wound that the very blood they sought to preserve had begun to fracture. The household staff whispered among themselves, recounting stories of Isaac moving silently through the halls at odd hours, appearing and disappearing without explanation. Some swore he had been seen standing in rooms without doors, or sitting by windows in total darkness, watching shapes that no one else could perceive. Eleanor documented these events meticulously in her ledger, each entry more unnerving than the last. Her handwriting shook, the ink smudged, but she could not stop. She felt compelled to record the boy's existence, to create a record of what the Harringtons had wrought, even if it was too horrifying to share. Winter deepened, and the isolation of Ashcroft Hall became almost absolute. Visitors ceased entirely. Jonathan forbade all contact with the outside world. The gates were barred, shutters closed, and the hallways grew cold and dim. Isaac did not seem to notice the seasons, the chill, or the decay around him. His focus was elsewhere, on the patterns in the wood, the shadows on the walls, the quiet rhythm of the house itself. By the spring of 1942, Eleanor began to understand something she could not name. Isaac was not merely a child. He was a culmination, a living testament to the Harringtons, unwavering adherence to their bloodline. Every anomaly, every peculiar strength and deficiency in him, was the product of 16 generations of isolation, control, and repetition. He was intelligence and deformity, calculation and unpredictability, all bound into a single body and mind. Even Jonathan V.I. began to whisper, late at night, of the compact and its cost. The family had built something extraordinary, but extraordinary had become unrecognizable. They had nurtured a legacy of purity, yet the purity had manifested as a child who could not exist anywhere but within the narrow walls of Ashcroft Hall. Eleanor, alone at her desk one night, wrote her final observations before sleep claimed her. Isaac Harrington is not merely our son. He is the echo of all we have done, the embodiment of every choice made in secrecy and pride. We cannot understand him. Perhaps we never were meant to. And yet, he is ours, the final proof of the compact, and the living testament of 16 generations. What becomes of us now I do not know, but I feel the answer lies in him alone. The house held its breath as spring approached. Shadows shifted across the walls. Isaac sat in his usual place, silent and still, eyes fixed upon something unseen, preparing the family, and the bloodline, for the inevitable reckoning to come. By the autumn of 1942, Isaac Harrington had begun to display behaviors that defied even Eleanor and Jonathan's understanding. The boy's mind moved with a precision and calculation that suggested thought far beyond his 6 years, yet his body bore the unmistakable marks of the family's relentless compact. His limbs were long and sinewy, bending in ways that suggested flexibility but also subtle instability. His head, slightly elongated at the crown, bore ridges along the parietal bones that Dr. Graves had noted as unusual but could not explain. Eleanor observed these changes with a mixture of awe and terror, recording each with a meticulousness that bordered on obsession. The family's private library became Isaac's domain. Stacks of books, many centuries old, lined the shelves from floor to ceiling. He would climb silently among them, scanning titles that were far beyond the comprehension of any child, sometimes stopping to flip pages with care. It was not the act of reading, Eleanor realized, but a kind of silent communion with knowledge itself. In these moments, the boy seemed both present and absent, inhabiting a space that belonged neither to the family nor to the normal world. Dr. Graves returned for a visit in October. The old physician, now 75, approached Ashcroft Hall with trepidation. He had been called reluctantly, summoned by Jonathan VI to assess the boy's progress. Though both men knew the truth, no doctor could fully measure what Isaac had become. Graves' journal entry that night read, "I have examined many children in my career, some with deformities, some with intelligence beyond their years, but Isaac Harrington is not a child in the sense we understand. He is an amalgam of generations, a vessel shaped by our insistence on control. His body is both fragile and indomitable. His mind, I suspect, is not entirely his own. He understands more than he should. He perceives more than we can name." Isaac's behaviors had grown more complex. He would move objects in the house while remaining unseen, placing them in precise arrangements that suggested some internal logic. Eleanor, who often followed him at a distance, found her own sense of reality bending. Candlesticks, books, and furniture were repositioned overnight into patterns that resembled diagrams she could not interpret. Sometimes, when Jonathan returned from the fields, he found his son standing silently in the hall, hands raised as if conducting a symphony only he could hear. It was during one of these nights that Isaac began to produce new sounds. These were not the simple sequences he had made before. They were layered, intricate, and almost musical, resonating through the hallways in rhythms that seemed aligned with the structure of the building itself. Eleanor recorded them as best she could, using notation that would later prove indecipherable. Jonathan, watching from the doorway, felt a chill he could not shake. "He is mapping the house," he whispered once to Eleanor. "He is mapping Ashcroft Hall, and we are the subjects of his experiment." As the weeks passed, the family's isolation deepened. The servants, long accustomed to peculiarities, became more subdued, their presence reduced to silent observation. Even they sensed that Isaac was not merely a child to be managed, but an entity whose existence carried the weight of the Harringtons' entire bloodline. Eleanor noted the subtle ways the boy's gaze could unsettle the staff, a glance that seemed to pierce past the flesh and bone to the very history of the house. In December of 1942, Jonathan began reviewing the family's records, tracing every marriage, every birth, every death over the 16 generations of the compact. He did so not out of curiosity but out of necessity, compelled by a dawning understanding that Isaac represented the culmination of their ambition and their pride. The genealogical tables, once symbols of control and continuity, now read like warnings. Jonathan traced lines that looped impossibly back on themselves: uncles who were cousins, cousins who were grandparents. The repetition was mathematical, relentless, and terrifying. Eleanor, meanwhile, began to study Isaac's physical anomalies more closely. She measured the length of his limbs, the angles of his joints, the contours of his skull. Each day brought new discoveries. Extra ribs, slight asymmetry in the pelvis, small deviations in the vertebrae, none of which impeded function, but all of which added to the sense that Isaac was a living record of hereditary precision and hereditary error. She documented everything, aware that these notes might be the only record of a child who should not exist, a child who was both miracle and warning. By late December, it became clear that Isaac's development was entering a new phase. His mental acuity had advanced to the point where Eleanor could no longer anticipate his reactions. He seemed aware of patterns before they occurred, predicting movements, sounds, even the behavior of the family animals. One evening, Eleanor watched him place candles in a spiral across the library floor, then step back and remain perfectly still as if waiting for some invisible force to respond. The room, bathed in the flickering light, seemed to breathe in time with the boy, and Eleanor felt a shiver that passed from the soles of her feet to her spine. The Harrington Compact, once a symbol of control and security, had produced its ultimate heir, and in the flickering shadows of Ashcroft Hall, Eleanor understood the full weight of her family's ambition. Isaac was more than a child. He was the culmination of centuries of preservation and secrecy, the living embodiment of 16 generations of choices, and the first sign that the compact, while intended to endure, might have created something neither the family nor the world could survive. The winter of 1943 brought a bitter cold to Ashcroft Hall, and with it, a deepening unease that settled over the Harrington family like frost on the windows. Isaac Harrington, now approaching 7 years of age, had begun to exhibit behaviors that defied even Eleanor's growing comprehension. He no longer played with toys, no longer interacted with the household staff, and spent entire days moving through the halls and corridors as though he were cataloging, mapping, and testing everything in his environment. Eleanor, observing from behind doors and along staircases, sometimes felt as though the house itself had become an extension of the boy, each wall, each staircase, each shadow tuned to his presence. Dr. Graves, declining further in health, had warned Eleanor and Jonathan repeatedly that Isaac's case was unlike anything he had seen, or could have seen, in his long medical career. But the Harringtons, guided by a mix of fear and pride, ignored the warnings. They could not admit that their centuries of compact, the meticulous preservation of their bloodline, might have produced something beyond understanding. They could only observe, record, and contain. One morning, Eleanor found Isaac in the old drawing room, crouched beneath the crystal chandelier. He had taken lengths of string from her sewing basket and stretched them taut across the room, connecting points of furniture, shelves, and doorways. At each intersection, he had placed small, hand-carved wooden figurines, all identical, all facing inwards toward the center of the room. Eleanor knelt at the threshold, holding her breath, feeling an odd, rising sense of dread. When Isaac looked up, his gaze did not rest on her as a person. It moved past her, through her, cataloging her presence as if she were simply another variable in an experiment. By now, the family had ceased inviting any visitors. The servants no longer lingered in common areas. Ashcroft Hall, once a symbol of the Harringtons' prestige, had become a living, breathing enclosure, a laboratory of blood, inheritance, and isolation. Jonathan spent long hours poring over the genealogical tables, comparing them to medical notes, cross-referencing physical anomalies, deaths, and the few surviving children. What he noticed was undeniable: the compact had created a genetic bottleneck of unparalleled severity. Isaac was not merely a product of inbreeding. He was the literal endpoint, the convergence of 16 generations, compressed into a single, unpredictable individual. It was in February that Dr. Graves arrived one last time. Eleanor had insisted, though she knew, as did Graves, that no examination could yield comfort or clarity. The doctor carried his stethoscope with trembling hands, noting the boy's asymmetric chest, the reversed placement of his heart, the unusual rigidity of his joints. He probed gently, measuring reflexes, noting the boy's responses, or lack thereof. But it was not the physical anomalies that held his attention. It was the boy's mind, and the eerie, impossible intelligence that seemed to radiate outward from Isaac in waves, as though he were simultaneously observing, calculating, and anticipating. Graves recorded in his journal, "There are patterns in the boy's behavior that defy explanation. He arranges objects with intent, responds to stimuli before they occur, and reacts to my presence in a manner that suggests comprehension of forces I cannot name. I am compelled to believe that Isaac Harrington has exceeded the bounds of ordinary human development. His body is fragile, yet resilient. His mind is precise, yet alien. I fear that we are witnessing the product of 16 generations of deliberate inbreeding manifest as something other than human. The boy himself was not aware of the fear he elicited. He moved through Ashcroft Hall with the same meticulous calm, arranging, observing, and cataloging. Eleanor noticed that he had begun to touch the walls, the floors, and even the ceilings, tracing invisible lines that seemed to connect the house into a larger geometric whole. On some nights, she would find him sitting in the highest turret, staring at the horizon through a telescope she did not recall giving him, seemingly measuring distances, calculating angles, tracing routes that only he understood. By mid-March, the Harringtons began to realize that Isaac's intellect was not just advanced, it was fundamentally different. The boy would complete complex mathematical sequences without instruction, solve problems they did not pose, and anticipate events days in advance. Eleanor felt the weight of centuries pressing down in these moments, the accumulated obsession of a bloodline now embodied in a single child whose existence was impossible to reconcile with human norms. The family had tried to protect Isaac, shield him from the outside world, and maintain the illusion that all was well. But by now, the truth was evident. The compact had not preserved purity. It had concentrated it, amplified it, and transformed it into a being that defied the rules of life itself. One evening, Eleanor followed him into the library and found Isaac at the large oak table, drawing patterns in chalk that spiraled outward in perfect symmetry. He did not acknowledge her presence. The lines, arcs, and intersecting shapes suggested some internal order, some hidden logic, yet Eleanor could not decode it. As she watched, she felt a creeping dread, a sense that she was witnessing the blueprint of the Harrington legacy laid bare, a legacy not of prosperity or honor, but of genetic obsession made manifest. The compact, she realized, had finally delivered its ultimate product. And the family, so long devoted to controlling bloodlines, could no longer control the boy who embodied all their ambition, their secrecy, and their hubris. By the summer of 1944, the Harrington estate had become almost unrecognizable to anyone who remembered it from before the war. The gardens, once manicured and pristine, had twisted into a wild, tangled mass of thorn and ivy, encroaching upon the house itself. Paint peeled from the siding, shutters sagged on their hinges, the iron gates, rusted and immobile, blocked entrance to the world beyond. The Harrington family had all but withdrawn entirely from society, leaving Isaac as the central presence in a house that had grown, in every sense, around him. Eleanor's journal entries from that period reflect a growing desperation and awe. She wrote that Isaac's development could no longer be measured by ordinary standards. By age 9, he could solve problems in ways that suggested a comprehension of physics beyond that of a typical adult, manipulating objects, weights, and pulleys in the attic, as though constructing models of some unseen mechanism. Yet his behavior was never playful. There was no curiosity for amusement, no laughter, no lightness of spirit. Every action, every gesture appeared intentional, as if each movement was part of a larger, unknowable design. Jonathan Harrington, Eleanor's husband, spent long hours in the family archives, examining records dating back to the 1600s. He charted the marriages, the births, the deaths, the illnesses, and the deformities. It became painfully clear to him that the Harrington compact, the family's centuries-long insistence on marrying within the bloodline, had produced not just fragile, malformed bodies, but an intelligence that operated according to rules entirely foreign to ordinary human experience. The closer he looked, the more he understood that Isaac was not merely exceptional. He was the direct consequence of 16 generations of genetic compression, a human being assembled with a precision and a disregard for vitality that bordered on the unnatural. It was during one of these sessions that Eleanor began to notice something far more unsettling. Isaac had started to exhibit behaviors that suggested an awareness of the family's past, a cognition of the compact itself. He would sit for hours poring over the genealogical tables, touching the names lightly with his fingers, tracing connections and gaps, murmuring sequences of numbers and letters that neither parent could comprehend. It was as though he were deciphering an internal code, not simply understanding the human relationships, but interpreting something deeper, an underlying order to the Harrington bloodline that only he could perceive. Dr. Graves, despite his declining health, returned in late July after receiving urgent messages from Eleanor. He arrived to find Isaac in the great hall, surrounded by a lattice of thread, books, and diagrams, every item meticulously arranged according to some logic the doctor could not hope to interpret. Graves's notes are revealing. The child's mind does not operate within normal parameters. Isaac Harrington appears to perceive his surroundings in a manner that suggests a layering of reality beyond my understanding. He categorizes and analyzes simultaneously, processing sensory input, historical data, and internal logic at a rate incomprehensible to ordinary human cognition. Physically, he remains fragile yet remarkably resilient, a body that should have failed long ago continuing to function, if not normally, then according to its own internal laws. Isaac's interaction with the family grew increasingly distant. He no longer responded to his mother's calls with affection, nor to Jonathan's coaxing with recognition. Eleanor, in her more lucid moments, began to fear that the boy's intellect had detached from his humanity entirely. She observed him staring through windows at distant forests, taking note of patterns in the trees, the clouds, the movement of light, as if mapping the world in ways no one else could. On some evenings, she would hear him chanting softly to himself in sequences of numbers, letters, and sounds that resonated in the corners of the house with a chilling, precise cadence. By autumn, Eleanor understood the full scale of the truth. The Harrington Compact had not created a family preserved, a legacy protected, or a line continued. It had produced a singular organism, a living repository of all the genetic design, ambition, and secrecy of generations. Isaac was not a boy in the conventional sense. He was the physical and intellectual embodiment of a family's obsession, a product of human engineering disguised as inheritance. And the Harringtons, who had believed themselves caretakers of this lineage, had no power over him. The most alarming development came during one quiet evening in October. Eleanor found Isaac in the library, seated before the genealogical tables, but now he had begun marking the connections between individuals with strange symbols that neither parent had seen before. When Eleanor questioned him, he simply looked up, his expression unreadable, and whispered a single word: order. It was neither a child's whim nor a human request. It was a declaration, a statement of purpose. In that moment, Eleanor realized that their attempts to control, shelter, and preserve had failed utterly. Isaac's mind had expanded beyond the house, beyond the bloodline, beyond comprehension. He was no longer merely the last of the Harringtons. He was something else entirely, a living artifact of 16 generations of human obsession, and the harbinger of consequences no one in the family could possibly foresee. By early 1945, the Harrington estate was steeped in a quiet dread that no visitor could penetrate. The few who still came, rare cousins, distant lawyers, and Dr. Graves, when health permitted, remarked only on the oppressive silence, the way the house seemed to breathe slowly, as though aware of each step, each sound. Isaac, now approaching 11, had grown taller, leaner, yet still carried the same inhuman stillness that had haunted the family for years. He moved through rooms like a specter, his eyes perpetually calculating, examining, noting every detail, every deviation, as though auditing the very walls for flaws in their design. The first incident that shook Eleanor and Jonathan occurred on a night when the wind rattled the shutters and moonlight struck the library floor in slanted rectangles. Eleanor had been reviewing old correspondence between Harrington ancestors, letters and ledgers spanning 3 centuries, when Isaac appeared behind her, moving silently across the worn parquet. She looked up to find him holding one of the ledgers she had placed aside, a volume she thought he could not yet read. "I know," he said softly, in the same precise, even tone he had used over the past year. The word was simple, but the weight behind it was immense. Eleanor's hand shook. She asked him, "No, what?" "Isaac." He didn't answer directly. Instead, he placed the book on the table and drew a series of symbols in the margins with careful, deliberate strokes, symbols that no one had seen before, not in any records, not in any of the family's archives. Jonathan, summoned by Eleanor's alarmed tone, studied the markings under lamplight and found the arrangement chilling. They were diagrams, not unlike those found in anatomical or engineering treatises, yet they were unmistakably human and biological in focus. They mapped bloodlines, birth defects, deformities, and patterns of disease, interwoven with codes the Harringtons could not comprehend. Jonathan's mind raced. Isaac was charting the genetic history of the family, and adding to it, the realization struck both parents cold. The boy was not merely learning the past, he was redesigning it, interpreting it in ways they could not understand. Dr. Graves arrived 2 days later, having been summoned urgently. He watched in increasing alarm as Isaac explained the diagrams using gestures, letters, and sequences of numbers. Graves wrote in his journal, "The child's comprehension of heredity and pathology is nothing short of revolutionary. He observes patterns in recessive traits, deformities, and mortality with a clarity I cannot match, even with years of study. He appears to have an intuitive grasp of genetics that transcends human understanding. I am witnessing a mind functioning at a level that may be non-human in scope." But it was not merely intelligence that terrified them. Isaac began manipulating the physical environment, experimenting in ways that suggested knowledge of anatomy and physiology well beyond his years. He handled preserved specimens from the family collection, bones, organs, and samples kept in jars since the early 1800s, with a care and understanding that no child could possibly possess. Eleanor shivered when she saw him dissect a frog with surgical precision, noting anomalies in the musculature, the nervous system, and the heart. He seemed almost to be comparing each specimen to the Harrington bloodline itself, calculating deviations, flaws, and consistencies. By spring, the family realized that Isaac had developed a new language, one that was half numerical, half symbolic, a synthesis of anatomy, genealogy, and logic. He would retreat into the attic for hours, sometimes days, scribbling on the walls with chalk, connecting ideas that no one else could read. Eleanor feared that the boy was isolating himself from human consciousness entirely, retreating into an intellectual world of his own making. The first violent incident occurred when a visiting distant cousin tried to coax Isaac into socializing. The boy's response was swift, precise, and terrifying. He struck with a force no child should possess, pinning the adult against the wall with a strength that left the visitor bruised and shaken. It was not a display of anger, nor of malice, but of calculation, an enforcement of boundaries, a demonstration that the estate, the bloodline, and the knowledge contained therein were under his control. The Harringtons themselves began to realize that their family, their traditions, their careful records, had culminated in something that could no longer be guided or restrained. Eleanor's diary entries from this period are marked by despair. She writes of the boy who is simultaneously her son and a stranger, who carries the legacy of 16 generations and yet refuses to be human. She writes of rooms filled with strange symbols, diagrams, and measurements. She writes of shadows in corners that seem to move when Isaac is present. And she writes of a truth she cannot voice aloud, that the Harrington Compact, the family obsession with purity, has created a being whose intelligence, physicality, and presence surpass the parents themselves, and for whom they can no longer claim authority. By the end of 1945, the Harrington estate was no longer merely a home. It had become a laboratory, a sanctuary, a prison, and a testament. Isaac Harrington, the living endpoint of 16 generations, had assumed dominion over all that remained. Eleanor and Jonathan could only observe, powerless, recording the unfolding reality in their journals, marking time, counting the years until they understood, or until they feared there might be nothing to understand. The winter of 1946 brought a stillness that seemed unnatural even for the remote Harrington estate. Snow blanketed the grounds, muffling every sound, leaving only the house's occasional groans as it contracted against the cold. Inside, Isaac Harrington moved through the hallways with the same deliberate precision as always, his small hands tracing the walls, cataloging the wood grain, the cracks in plaster, the ever-present signs of age and decay. Eleanor and Jonathan, now wary and haggard, observed him with a mixture of awe and dread. The boy was no longer a child in any conventional sense. He was a measure, a calculation, a living index of everything the Harringtons had wrought through centuries of careful isolation. By early January, the extent of Isaac's experiments had grown impossible to ignore. The attic was no longer a playroom or even a study. It had become a repository of specimens, sketches, and jars containing human and animal organs. Every surface was marked with symbols and annotations in Isaac's precise, small script. Eleanor had tried to intervene once, gently moving a jar of preserved tissue, and found her hands shoved aside with a force that left her breathless. The boy's eyes, wide and unblinking, conveyed neither fear nor malice. They reflected calculation, inevitability, and the certainty of purpose. Jonathan whispered that it was as if Isaac understood his parents' genes better than they themselves did. It was in the early hours of February 14th that the true scope of Isaac's comprehension revealed itself. Eleanor awoke to the sound of soft, repetitive tapping. Following it through the halls, she found him in the family library, seated before a massive ledger that contained 3 centuries of Harrington births and deaths. The boy's small fingers moved with exacting rhythm, connecting names, dates, and causes of death with lines and geometric symbols. He did not speak, but his lips moved as if murmuring to himself. Eleanor later wrote that she felt as though the ledger were alive, as though it had drawn him into its pages, and he had become an extension of it. Jonathan, roused by her trembling voice, came to witness the scene. The ledger showed a network so intricate it was almost impossible to follow. Cousins, second cousins, and more distant relatives were interconnected in loops, their unions marked with meticulous notes about congenital defects, stillbirths, and early deaths. At first, Jonathan could not comprehend the calculations. But then he realized Isaac was predicting outcomes. The boy had discovered, through observation, memory, and analysis, formulas that could determine the likelihood of physical and cognitive abnormalities before birth. Horrified, Jonathan spoke. "Isaac, what are you doing?" The boy's response was slow, deliberate. "Completing the pattern," he said. Understanding the design, there was no anger in his tone, only certainty, the quiet inevitability of a law no one else could perceive. The words sent shivers down both parents' spines. They had taught him letters and numbers, allowed him access to the family records, but nothing could have prepared them for this. Isaac was not just studying his heritage. He was commanding it. That evening, Dr. Graves was called to the estate. Now 80, his hands shook as he attempted to examine the boy, but Isaac's demeanor had changed. No longer merely silent and still, he watched the doctor with a scrutiny that was almost clinical, almost alien. Graves would later write, "The boy's mind seems detached from ordinary human consciousness. He observes, calculates, and records with precision that defies normal comprehension. He is, in every sense, the culmination of the Harrington Compact, yet something more, something I cannot name or rationalize." The final confrontation came in March of 1946. Eleanor and Jonathan had realized that the boy's intelligence and physical prowess had surpassed their control. They attempted, desperately, to remove the attic ledger, to prevent him from continuing his work. Isaac resisted, not with violence, but with strategy. He had memorized the layout of every room, every locking mechanism, every structural detail of the estate. By the time the parents reached the attic, he had already secured the ledger and hidden it behind a false panel in the walls. When Eleanor demanded the book, the boy spoke. "It is not yours. It never was. It belongs to the line. It belongs to me." His tone was unwavering. The power in that statement was absolute. In that moment, the Harringtons understood that they were no longer the stewards of their own bloodline. They were observers, powerless to alter the trajectory they had set in motion centuries ago. In the weeks that followed, Isaac's experiments became more complex, more alarming. He began combining anatomical knowledge with the family genealogies, creating detailed charts that suggested interventions, corrective measures, and combinations that the Harringtons dared not attempt. He was mapping the family's genetic future, calculating patterns, and perhaps even correcting deviations according to his own unknowable design. And always, he moved with the same eerie detachment, his face calm, unchanging, his eyes wide and clear, reflecting something entirely beyond human comprehension. Eleanor recorded in her final diary entry, before the family's last departure from the estate, "We have given birth to something that has exceeded us. Isaac is the fulfillment of our covenant, yet he is not ours. He watches, he calculates, he knows what we could not. The Harrington Compact has ended. The line survives in him alone, but at what cost?" By 1947, the Harrington estate had become almost unrecognizable. The grand halls, once gleaming with polished wood and oil lamps, had fallen into shadowed decay. Snow and ice cracked windows and warped floors. The gardens had gone untended for years, and the ornamental hedges, carefully sculpted by generations of Harrington hands, were now wild tangles of thorns and brambles. Yet inside, Isaac Harrington thrived. He alone moved with purpose through the wreckage, meticulously maintaining his ledgers, jars, and charts as though the rest of the world had never existed. Eleanor and Jonathan left the estate that spring, their departure quiet, almost unnoticed. They took only the barest necessities and swore each other to secrecy. Isaac did not protest. He had already calculated this eventuality, the covenant, the line, the purity of the Harringtons. He held it all within his mind, within his meticulous records. To him, absence was not abandonment, it was observation at a distance, an experiment continuing without interference. Years passed. Letters from townspeople, local officials, and distant relatives arrived and were ignored, unheeded. Isaac grew physically strong but physically unusual. His spine remained slightly curved, a subtle mirror of the generational deformities that had plagued his ancestors, yet he moved with a fluidity that belied his body. His mind, however, remained extraordinary. By 1955, he had mastered all known subjects in the Harrington Library, from advanced mathematics and anatomy to classical literature, and the obscure histories of colonial Virginia families. He wrote in his journals and in the margins of genealogical ledgers, recording patterns, making observations that no one else could verify. Visitors never came. Isaac had ensured it. He locked the estate doors, fortified windows, and cultivated the illusion of decay to keep outsiders away. Even the servants who remained, two elderly women who had served generations of Harringtons, spoke rarely, their whispers muffled by fear. They noted with uneasy fascination how the boy-turned-man would sit for hours in the library, tracing family names, observing minutiae, speaking occasionally to himself in precise, rhythmic tones that made no sense to human ears. By 1960, Isaac's work had reached a terrifying sophistication. He had begun cataloging not only the existing family tree, but also projecting potential unions, simulating centuries into the future. He drew lines connecting distant cousins with surgical precision, calculated probabilities of deformities, and annotated each outcome. His mind was an archive, a living machine that merged observation, deduction, and inherited knowledge. The Harrington bloodline, once bound by ritual and tradition, now existed solely in him, perfected in form yet grotesque in its consequence. The first signs of physical collapse began in 1967. Isaac's hands trembled while writing, joints ached unpredictably, and faint curves appeared in his teeth, echoing the deformities of previous generations. Yet his intellect did not falter. If anything, his observation sharpened. Focused by the isolation and the certainty of being the final node of the covenant, he moved through the estate as though cataloging both history and the inevitability of his own decline. Isaac Harrington died on October 3, 1982, at the age of 44. The estate had long been abandoned, save for him and the two servants, who had endured decades of silent complicity. When local authorities were finally called due to unpaid taxes and complaints of dereliction, they found the house nearly collapsed. Inside, Isaac was seated in the library, a chair too large for his frame, hands folded over the ledger that contained centuries of Harrington history. His eyes, open and unseeing, stared directly at the final page of the family tree. The autopsy revealed a body marked by a century of genetic pressure, organs misaligned, heart chambers irregular, liver scarred, kidneys malformed, bones were brittle, riddled with microfractures. Every indicator confirmed what the Harringtons had long denied. Centuries of consanguinity had concentrated damage to a level that modern science could scarcely comprehend. DNA analysis suggested a coefficient of inbreeding so extreme that Isaac's lineage had become effectively a singular, self-replicating genetic entity. He was the end of 16 generations, the culmination of a covenant designed to preserve purity at any cost. The ledger and journals were recovered and archived at a university, their contents preserved in climate-controlled vaults. Researchers, decades later, would study the documents, altering names and locations, but leaving the essential truth intact. Isaac Harrington became a case study in the dangers of extreme inbreeding and the consequences of isolation. Geneticists would later write, "Families who close themselves off do not preserve purity, they concentrate harm." Isaac's mind and body were the final proof. Though the estate was eventually demolished, and suburban developments replaced the wild gardens, whispers lingered. Children played near the old stone foundations, unaware of the lineage that had ended there. Scholars occasionally requested the Harrington journals, feeling the weight of what was preserved but never truly understood. And somewhere, in the margins of a ledger, a single, precise line remained, a note Isaac had written in 1946, almost a prophecy. The line survives in knowledge, but the world cannot contain what it cannot name. Even today, those who study the Harringtons claim they can sense the imprint of something beyond human comprehension, an echo of Isaac's final observation, waiting silently in the record of a family who perfected a covenant only to destroy themselves.